G'day everyone. Last one before Christmas. And you may also notice that this one is a bit late as well. It's now Saturday morning my time. It's about 6 a.m. Saturday morning my time. I would normally push these out the day before on Friday. But I have just been absolutely smashed with stuff this week. And I'm going to talk about some of it here, some of the reasons I've been smashed. So what have I been doing? Well, we're going to talk about the 5-part blog series in a moment. That'll be the main sort of story. I also recorded a new Pluralsight thing this week, and I can't tell you what it is just yet, but it's going to look much more like what we're doing here, but with the normal Pluralsight polish, not just me editing it in my home. And it is going to be out next month, and it's something totally new we're doing. I don't think we've really done it at all with Pluralsight. But anyway, I think you guys are going to really like this in terms of having information that you can use a little bit more broadly than just your deep technical stuff. So that's one thing. I did mention this early, so I'm on my coffee. The other thing is I spent 2 days up in Brisbane, as I think I mentioned, doing a workshop on Monday and Tuesday. First time I've ever been able to drive to a workshop, which is kind of cool. It's nice to have something that's home or close to home. And I was actually able to say to the kids, look, I've got to go and do my work, but I'm actually going to be home tonight, which is a really, really nice feeling. But actually, just on that, literally just before I sat down to record this, I saw the announcement come out. We're going to have a security conference here on the Gold Coast in my home. Well, not in my house, that would be a bit weird, but in my home city in April next year. And this is being run by the NDC folks. So many of you know that I do a lot of different things with NDC conferences now. And, I'm going to come back and explain why in a moment. But anyway, we're going to have the NDC security event, which is going to be a dedicated security thing, here on the Gold Coast in late April. I'm going to be there. Scott Helm is going to be there. Many of you know Scott. And a bunch of other people who we're yet to sort of announce and flesh out just yet too. But certainly the two of us will be there, which will be really cool. And if ever you were looking for an excuse to come to Australia or to come to the Gold Coast, then this is the one. So the NDC folks, I think it holds, what's the right way of putting it? For me, it's kind of like a bit of a special sort of series of events, because the first ever big international event I did was NDC in Oslo. And this would have been in, I'm pretty sure it was, when did I leave? 2014. And I had always had in my mind this image of NDC in Oslo being like the big event. And because I'd been listening to a lot of .NET Rocks and other series like this that were talking about how epic this thing was. So for me to be able to go there was just an absolutely out of this world kind of thing. And again, this was like 3.5 years ago, which is a very, very different life to what I have today. So I went to NDC and I was like, put an enormous amount of work into the talk, smashed it out of the park at 100% green feedback. Everyone loved the talk. And since then, I've just gone yes to basically everything that they do. So actually, on that front, I will be back in London next month at NDC. So I'll be in NDC doing the London thing in, I think it's about the 15th of Jan, 2-day workshop, and then I'll be at the conference doing some usual security thing talks. And I'll be at an NDC security day right after that in Oslo, and Oslo in January is pretty epic. It is actually really cool, not just metaphorically too. Very, very pretty spot. So I'll then be in Oslo the next week doing another workshop and another series of talks. So if you're around either of those places, that's awesome, but do come to Australia in April because that's super, super awesome. So that's actually the next thing that I have on in terms of actually having to travel anywhere or be formal. So pretty much as of yesterday, as I wrapped up that 5-part blog series, which is the thing that I really sort of wanted to commit to and get out before Christmas, that's the last thing that I had to do before the 13th of Jan when I've got to go back to London. So I now have exactly 3 weeks before I have to go anywhere or actually really do anything, which is awesome. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time outdoors. And, this is tangential to the blogging stuff and the weekly update. But this is the nice thing about Australia. We're kind of on the opposite end of the world now. Seasons and things are back to front. Christmas for us is just all about being outdoors and sort of lifestyle orientated things. So even yesterday I spent a couple of hours outdoors walking, then playing tennis with the family, and doing that. This is also partly why I couldn't get my weekly update video done, because I went and spent time with my family. Then we went out wake surfing and kneeboarding and doing all this sort of watery stuff, which is something that we do a lot of here. Incidentally, for those of you, because I'm still selling this come to the Gold Coast for the security event thing, we have more canals on the Gold Coast than Amsterdam and Venice combined. True story. Anywho, so it's a very, very kind of outdoorsy time of year, so I'm really looking forward to having a few weeks of just relaxing a lot, sending you all lots of photos on Twitter of the water, which I know people love, particularly in the UK sort of area. I know you guys love it. So anyway, that's going to be my next few weeks. I hope you guys are going to have an epic time as well. I know it's very, very different for different people around the world in terms of the things they do. And I am jealous of those of you who are going to be out snowboarding or doing something like that as well. Trust me. So let me move on, because I've got to talk about this week's stuff. And it was a big week. Now, I'm just sort of flicking back through some of these blog posts and trying to remember the highlights. So obviously the main thing I did this week was this Fixing Data Breaches series. And this was really in response to the time I spent in Washington, D.C. speaking to Congress about the impact of data breaches on knowledge-based authentication. And, I said back at the time, I think I said in the weekly update, I was there to position data breaches in terms of what does it mean for KBA, and we've got to do KBA better. But I really would like to try and have less data breaches in the first place. Like, this is where we want to move as an industry. And certainly the folks over there said, after I did my testimony and everything, look, let us know what you think. Like, how should we tackle this? So I've been working on this series for some time, the series that went out this week, and I wanted to do 5 separate things. It's not so much that I wanted to do 5 and fit it into a clean week, but I had 5 logical things in my mind. And I thought, look, I'll turn them into separate posts, because then when someone asks about a certain thing, then I can link them to that thing. So these posts I'll be using for years and years as reference points. And I want to run through these 5 areas now and sort of, I guess, add a little bit of narrative to why they're important. And the number one thing that I brought up, and I raised this multiple times in my congressional testimony and when I got questioned as well, is education. Now, obviously, I have a vested interest here, so I want to make that clear. I get paid by people watching my Pluralsight courses, or by doing workshops, or by people wanting to read my things, and then my traffic goes up, and sponsors want to sponsor me. All that stuff, everyone knows that. So that's pretty clear. I have a vested interest in the outcome, but I have such an interest in the outcome because it's such a damn good idea. And, really, let's think about this. Every time we see one of these data breaches, whether it be an exploit of something like SQL injection or an open S3 bucket somewhere, someone somewhere has made a mistake. Now, sometimes it is a very low-hanging fruit sort of mistake, so basic SQL injection flaws, direct object reference risks, things like that. But in fairness, sometimes it is also a very complex set of circumstances that lead to this outcome that is a data breach. So I don't want to overly trivialize it. However, there's always a mistake somewhere. And what I'm finding time and time again is when you look at these mistakes, either the mistake itself or other things that have led to it being much worse than what it needed to are due to human error and are due to education. So a perfect example of this is SQL injection, still the number one risk on the web today, even in the OWASP Top 10 2017. Well, it's injection, which is like a banner under which SQL injection fits, but most injection is SQL injection. It's still up there, and it is just coding flaws. And when you look at some of the material out there, in fact, in this blog post, I have an example of this, where there's this blog post. I've been using this for years. It's like the gift that keeps on giving. This blog post where a bloke has gone and written about how to do password resets. And he's got one SQL statement which is parameterized and it's resilient to SQL injection. And then right under that, literally on the same screen, there's this horrible piece of SQL code which is entirely vulnerable to SQL injection. And you would own the entire database. Now, I explain why I referenced this post in my part 1 of the data breach series Because, look, I don't want to just go and pick on random people and say, look, your code is shit. There's a very, very good reason related to some feedback that I gave him and the fact that the post remains up there. So point being that this is a case of as I explained in the blog post, being unconscious incompetence. And there are this theory of 4 stages of competency, where the first stage is you're not actually sure of what it is you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And I sort of use this as an explanation of where we need to move people away from. So education to me makes a huge amount of sense, not just because that's where the flaws are, but because it's also very cheap. So when you look at where you can put money on your security spend, so look at things like good automated analysis tools. And there are some very good ones out there. I've spoken about NetSparker many times before. And they're tools that you should use. They're excellent. You pay a lot of money for them. In fact, that's why they can charge so much money, because they are very excellent. Have a look at NetSparker or Checkmarks or something like that. Look at the amount of money it costs for those things. And compare that to the cost of training developers, whether it's going to the workshops I've just mentioned, whether it's watching Pluralsight. Pluralsight starts at like less than $1 a day. I mean, it's ridiculously small. That is just such a good ROI, because the return part of that investment is you're going to take out a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of the vulnerabilities that people write. And I mean, it's a very... I'm hesitating a little bit because actually trying to articulate how much money a company saves by not getting hacked is a very, very difficult thing to do. I think it's one of the problems we have, and I'll come back to that in the last part of this series. But anyway, it's a very, very good ROI, and it pays off over and over again across multiple projects and indeed across multiple jobs that the individual may have. It's a skill that they'll take with them for life. So I really, really like starting with education because it is a preventative measure, as opposed to, we just got seriously hosed, how can we make it less bad? Which brings us to the next point. So, fixing data breaches part 2, data ownership and minimization. And this is an interesting one because parts of it are just fundamentally simple, yet we seem to struggle with it. Now, here's what I mean by fundamentally simple. If you don't have a piece of data, you can't lose it. Makes sense, right? So, where I'm going with this is that we have this idea within organizations that the more data they have, the better. The better we can target our people, the more valuable our organization is because data is an asset. The more information we can collect, the more stuff we can sell and the more emails and the stuff we can send and I get it. I understand why it's valuable to companies to have this much data. And look, I mean, people lose their minds the whole time about how much the likes of Facebook have. It's just a staggeringly large amount of data. The thing is that inevitably, many of these companies have things go wrong and the data gets leaked. And you look at these breaches and you go, did you really need to have all of that? So I use the example of the Cat Forum. There is literally a website that is catforum.com, and it does exactly what it sounds like it does. And this is a vBulletin-based service, which is another series of problems altogether. But this particular service allows you to sign up and then fill in your profile. And your profile asks your date of birth. And I go, why do you need a date of birth to talk about cats? And the discussions around cats are all the sorts of things that you would expect, including things like whether or not you should eat out of the same bowl as your cat. And yes, that's a real thing. And I'll link to it in the post. Now, I'm not sure what value having someone's date of birth adds to the discussion about eating out of the same bowl as your cat. But I'm going to go with it and just say none. There's no value with this. And I sort of make the point in there, some people go, oh, you need to ask date of birth because of COPPA. Because in the US, there's this child online protection policy. The thing where you got to make sure that you're at least 13 years old. But you can establish whether someone is 13 years old without storing their date of birth. You can say, are you 13 years old? And then people go, oh yeah, but someone might lie. Well, that's what you can do when you collect a date of birth anyway. Or people say, no, you got to actually ask the exact date. Well, then ask it and then put a flag on the record and say, yes, over 13, and then not store the data. It's just entirely unnecessary. And things like date of birth, I literally referred to in my congressional testimony, where I explain the experience with my father upgrading his broadband and the telco literally saying, let us confirm that you are who you say you are, what's your date of birth? Now, if my dad goes onto catforum.com, wants to talk about eating out of the same bowl as the cat, leaves his date of birth, and then that gets owned, he's now just jeopardised his ability to upgrade his broadband, or at least for the company to know that it's him and not someone else. So, you see the problem. I haven't gone through all my emails yet this morning because it's early, but I glanced at a comment where someone said something along the lines of, the date of birth could be used so that the interaction between other people on the cat forum has more context or more information. Look, I can see how companies may spin having that information as a virtue. But one of the comments I made in my congressional testimony, and someone else actually gave me this comment in my sort of soliciting of feedback for what I should say, there's this constant view that data is an asset. This increases the value of what we do if we have the data. Yet, companies never see it as a liability. And frankly, having date of birth on a freaking cat forum is a liability. Some people also said after I wrote the post, well, this is the way vBulletin works, and you've taken the platform straight out of the box, and this is what it does. And I get that. If this is what it does by default, and I assume it does because I've got a lot of vBulletin forums in Have I Been Pwned with dates of birth, then that's really beholden on vBulletin to start adding a few more options about actually collecting these things. Because the sorts of forums that I've got in Have I Been Pwned where I've got birth dates is ridiculous. And I put a list of them all on the website. I think things like, on the blog post, I think things like the Cannabis Forum have date of birth. Now, I can understand why you might ask that, again, from a copper or from a are you this high to get in sort of. I did not mean to say that in relation to a Cannabis Forum. It is early. I didn't think through the implications of what they just said, but it was kind of funny now that I think about it. You must be this old to get into the site. So again, I can understand that, but you don't have to keep the data. So that's the minimization part of it. The ownership part of it is that there is a constant attitude that when companies collect your data, they own it. Now, I referenced GDPR a bit, and one of the things I find anytime I reference GDPR is there are a bunch of people who agree and there are a bunch of people who disagree. And there's a lot of experts out there that go, it means this and it doesn't mean that, or you... I'm really looking forward to GDPR actually being out there and actually being tested so that we have some cases that we can refer to. Because at the moment, every time anyone says anything about GDPR, other people disagree. And I have said many times that there are a lot of lawyers making a lot of money out of GDPR at the moment because of the fundamentally different views that people have on what the legislation means. But anyway, the sentiment of me referencing GDPR in this case was that there is a much greater or much stronger view of data ownership of the individual who the data is about. So, if I go and provide my name and my date of birth and my address, it is personal data. It is data that really I should own. GDPR also has a bunch about consent. So consent must be informed and explicit. If you're going to give your data to a site, they've got to be clear about how they're using it. Now, there are cases where data can be collected without consent, and I actually put an edit on the blog post because this was one of the things a few people were cranky about. We'll move on past that. But the sentiment here, and this is bigger than GDPR, the sentiment here is that if you're going to collect people's data, they should know about it. They should know what it is, how you're going to use it. They should have the right to ask for access to it. I should be able to go to a cat forum and say, hey guys, I came and talked about eating out of the same bowl as the cat. What information did I give you? And could you please delete it? And further to that, and again, totally independently of GDPR, we should really be thinking about how long do you need to retain my data after I've spoken about, maybe don't eat out of the same bowl. Should we keep it for a year, 5 years, 10 years? Because at the moment, the default for just about everything is let's keep it forever. Because purging is harder than retaining. Now, it's a little bit harder on something like a forum because how do you know when the person's going to come back? Or, does it kill our referential integrity if we delete someone's records? But particularly where there's very definable scopes around the usage of a data. So, for example, a competition. You sign up, competition runs, competition finishes. Companies like to keep the data because like a marketing funnel. Now we can come back and we can promote another competition to them. But really, you don't need it beyond the first competition. And the problem is that the competitions very often only run in the first place to collect the data, even though from the individual's perspective, it isn't really needed beyond that. So that's a bit of a mess. And the other aspect of that, which I touched on, which is also a big mess, is data aggregators. Now, this has been a big news story this year, primarily in the news because of Equifax, because it's a large American company that had a lot of personal data in it. But as I said in this blog post, there's also the whole South African situation, which I've spoken about here before. It's like everyone in the country had their data exposed, not just a subset like Equifax. And also, unlike Equifax, the data wasn't retained privately by some entity or individual who obtained it. This was data spread out over the internet. And this is a really nasty situation where you've got a company that had data on everyone up until about 3 years ago, including infants, including deceased individuals. They had all this data without any consent and they were able to sell it because this is what they do, data enrichment. They were able to sell that to people and they sold it to a real estate agency who backed it up and put it on a publicly facing web server and unauthorized parties downloaded it. This is crazy that we can have this situation where large aggregators can just take data without any consent and use it this way. And I know they say, yes, it's perfectly legal, and it probably is perfectly legal, but it shouldn't be. This is ridiculous. Now, having said that, and as I say in the blog post, there are valid use cases for data aggregation which are useful to society. So things like credit services where if I apply for, let's say, an American Express, they've got to be able to go and see what my credit history is. They're going to have to go to an aggregator like Equifax, who incidentally runs in Australia as well. They've got to be able to go to an entity like that and figure out whether I'm a safe bet to give a credit card to. I understand that. We need to be able to do that. But that stuff has got to be very, very carefully managed because Equifax. So that's part 2, data ownership minimization. Now, moving on to part 3, the ease of disclosure. And this is one that is close to my heart because of the number of times that it is a direct pain on my life. What I'm talking about here is that when I find data, and I mean, let's be clear, it's usually when people send me data. Sometimes it's when I find, let's say, vulnerability in an application somewhere. These days, frankly, so many people support Have I Been Pwned and are aware of what I do. They send me stuff and I don't tend to go looking for it. When I have something like this and I want to get in touch with the organization and let them know, I want to do this privately, I want to do it responsibly, it can very often be enormously painful. And I give some examples in this blog post. O web host a few years ago, 13 million plus email addresses and plain text passwords. And I'm just battling through their customer support and their online ticketing system just to try and find someone I can talk to. Cloud Pets earlier this year, multiple individuals tried to get in touch with the company to say, hey, you've got a MongoDB of your database open and the database contains data related to information collected by teddy bears with listening devices in them with children's voices. And they couldn't get in touch with them. And then the CEO later on tells a reporter, well, you don't... Let's try this again. He says, you don't reply to some random person about a data breach. And it's just... that sort of stuff is absolutely painful. And compounding that, a lot of people are worried about reporting vulnerabilities or exposed data because they think they're going to get into legal hot water. And as I say in the blog post, I can understand all of the viewpoints here. So I can understand why people would be worried about it. I can understand why in some cases an organization actually has to take legal action if something like this happens as well. So for example, I've got a couple of references in there to headlines of security researchers and legal trouble after reporting things. But these are cases where guys have done things like gone, oh, look, there's a direct object reference risk in your service, so I can actually like add one to the URL and get someone else's record. Hey, let's just make sure it's not a mistake and do it another 114,000 times. Well, yeah, now the company is going to have to be beholden to reporting this Someone has gone and pulled 114,000 records out of our system and accessed a lot of personal data. So in the blog post, I sort of say, look, there's a few things here. We need to be responsible as individuals reporting these vulnerabilities. And being responsible means not accessing large swathes of customer data. Once you see one other person's record, bang, you've just demonstrated that there's an unauthorized access situation, right? There's a lack of access controls. That should be enough. And I understand when people say, yes, but I didn't think that the company would take it seriously if I only pulled one other record. And then that's beholden on the company. They need to take it seriously. So you can see the situation here, but what I sort of say is, let us all agree that no matter how the individual found the vulnerability, no matter what they did with it, no matter whether their hat is black or grey or white, whatever it is, we all agree that it is best the company knows about this, right? Like, above and beyond everything else, we need the company to know about this. So there's a few things in there that I suggest in order to make this easier. So one is that I love the idea of having a security vulnerability reporting policy. And Tesla's got a great one. So I linked to Tesla's. And it's text. Like, this is how hard it is. This is not sort of, let's build more secure code and have a big pipeline of developers getting trained and doing awesome things over a long period of time and pay money for courses or whatever. It's not only that. It's like, can you write text that explains, here's what we would like to know if you find anything, or here's our email address, here's our PGP key if you'd like to encrypt it. If you find something, please let us know, and if you adhere to these guidelines, we're not going to take any legal action. Like, this is just a really good, sensible thing to do. And it's text on a page. The thing that I think most organizations struggle with in terms of creating any sort of vulnerability reporting policy is lawyers. Because you can imagine going to sort of the corporate counsel and going, hey, we would like it if people if people who are potentially engaging in illegal activity find anything nasty, we'd like them to tell us, and then we're not going to throw the book at them if they do. Imagine how the lawyers react to that. But that's not in our best interest, that lawyery reaction, because we want people to report. The other thing that I suggest is having a security.txt file. Now, this may be new to a lot of people, but this is a super cool thing. So security.txt, think about a robots.txt, right? It's just a text file that has instructions in it. Except security.txt is really meant to be consumable by humans, and it has an email address, it can have a link to a public key in case you want to encrypt things, it can have a couple of other things. There's a draft spec being submitted to IETF about how this should work, and it is dead simple. I put one on Have I Been Pwned this week, which I have been meaning to do for a while. It's very early days. Look, it might be something that takes off, I don't know, but it is a freaking text file with an email address in it. And when I think about the situation I've been in so many times where I'm trying to think about how do I get in touch with a company, if I was to find either that vulnerability reporting policy or that text file with an email address that is going to be something like security@company or something along those lines, suddenly my attitude would change fundamentally, because I know that the company has thought about this. I know that they are now conscious that there are security flaws in their things sometimes, and they want to know about it, and they're providing a means by which I can discover this. That just fundamentally changes the landscape. So go and have a look at that and think about what you can do in those really, really simple ways in order to get people reporting responsibly. All right, that was part 3. Now, part 4, bug bounties. Now, bug bounties, to be honest, is in a similar realm to the previous point about making disclosure easy. The main thing that's different is that I love the way that bug bounties change the economics of vulnerabilities. And I give an example on here about LinkedIn. So LinkedIn got hacked around 2012. The data was exposed last year. In fact, the data was sold last year on a dark web marketplace, sold for 5 Bitcoin, which sounds like a lot of money today, except 5 Bitcoin back then was about $2,000. So here you've got someone who's, think about the chronology of it. Someone found a vulnerability in LinkedIn. They sucked out the data. Years later, they, or potentially someone downstream of the original attacker, is selling the data on a marketplace. That data is obtained by other people. It eventually spreads everywhere. It's now very easy to find online for anyone to download. And just to add to that, only a couple of months ago, a person allegedly responsible, it's not quite clear whether it was for the original breach or somehow involved in it, has been arrested in Prague, will be extradited to the US, and they're going to have a very, very bad time of potentially the rest of their life. That thing didn't work out well for anyone. It didn't work out well for those of us in the LinkedIn data breach, including myself, insofar as our information got leaked. Look, I had a strong password, totally random, one password, all this sort of thing. Even though it was stored as a SHA-1 hash, no one's going to be able to do anything with it. But plenty of people out there are still having accounts compromised due to data leaked via LinkedIn. So not good for the victims. Not good for LinkedIn. Would have cost them a lot of money to deal with that. They would not have had a good time of it at all. Not good for hacker because they're going to be in jail for a very long time as a result of this. So how can we change the financial incentives of what happened there? Because clearly there was a financial incentive. What if, when that person discovered that vulnerability, there was a bug bounty in place where they could go and say, hey, I have managed to discover how to find this data. You wouldn't really want to suck down 165 million records or whatever it was as part of a bug bounty. That would normally go out of scope and lead to other problems. But I've found the vulnerability. Let's say it was SQL injection. I've found the SQL injection vulnerability. This is the vector. This is how to exploit it. And they got paid for that. Now, not only did they get paid for it, but that is a high severity finding, right? We know it's high severity because there's now 160 plus million records out there. So it would probably pay very well. Maybe for argument's sake, it's a 10 grand vulnerability. For a company like LinkedIn, you'd kind of hope so. Now, to be fair as well, 5 years ago when it happened, probably not going to be it was probably not going to be a 10 grand vulnerability, and LinkedIn didn't have a bug bounty at that time anyway. Not sure if they do today. Microsoft certainly does, and they own, anyway. Let's say it's today. It's going to be something like that. Now, someone can say, okay, well, not only can I score myself 10 grand, but I can do it legally, right? And this is the trick. So this is part of the economics of it. If you can ensure that someone does get financially compensated for finding a vulnerability and they can cash in without personal risk to themselves, see how different this situation would be. Bloke who found it's going to walk away with, again, say 10K. None of us are going to have our data exposed publicly. LinkedIn is going to pay 10K, and I bet you they have paid probably 1,000 times more than that cleaning up this data breach. I bet you it was 10 million bucks or something like that. By the time you get everyone in, just do the math, everything that goes into cleaning up a breach. So that just seems like a fundamentally sensible idea, doesn't it? And again, it's economics. How can we change the balance such that it makes more sense to disclose it for someone, even if they're just financially motivated? There's plenty of people out there that just want to do the right thing and make the world a better place and don't expect anything in return. But for those folks that really do want to make money out of it, well, then give them an incentive to do so in a responsible fashion. So I love this idea. And, bug bounties have been growing massively. The prevalence of bug bounties has been growing massively. We've now got many of the largest tech companies offering bug bounties, like Microsoft, I mentioned before. Apple has a $200,000 bug bounty, up to $200,000, if you find serious vulnerabilities in iOS. One of the criticisms of the likes of Apple has been they've got to meet the market. So the problem is that yes, you can get 200 grand from Apple. There are other companies out there that will give you 500 grand because they want those bounties to then be able to sell them as interception tools to law enforcement and things like that. Sorry, they want those bounties. They want those bugs so that they can then sell them. So you've got to have a competitive bounty scheme as well. Now that's a whole other discussion, how to pitch that, and that's a discussion that, frankly, other organisations like BugCrowd are the best to help people with. And I talk about BugCrowd in here because I really like the idea of what they do, being that they do manage bug bounty programs. So if you're in a company and you go, look, I like the idea of bug bounties, but we'd get a flood of information come back, we'd have to triage it all, we'd have to figure out how to pay them, we'd have to go through all of these mechanics. You go to the likes of BugCrowd and they run it for you. Now, some of you who follow me will be familiar with BugCrowd, run by an Aussie bloke called Casey Ellis, who's done very, very good over in the US. It's now a very well-funded, very successful company, And you've probably heard Casey on, say, the Risky Business podcast or on other news outlets because he's become quite the celebrity in this bug space. And I just love how down to earth this company is around the way they handle this space and about how accessible they've made bounties to organisations. Now, I have no affiliation other than that. I just think they do cool stuff. So if you're interested in bug bounties, go and check that out because you should really be thinking about that. And as I say in the blog post, for every organisation who I speak to, and I sort of say, you should be thinking about bug bounties, and then someone turns around and with this sort of very worried face, they go, well, doesn't that mean people are going to be testing our things? It's like, you are getting free penetration tests the whole time anyway. The only difference is no one's telling you about the results. So go and check out bug bounties. They make a huge amount of sense, and they should be something that, frankly, feature in any organisation of scale. All right, now last thing, and this was yesterday's post, penalties. And really, this had to feature somewhere. Like, we don't want to see them take place. I don't want to see companies getting fined. But we need penalties because, again, we need like a financial lever to get organisations doing the right thing. And what worries me at the moment is that there's not enough disincentive to have a data breach. Now, I've been on the inside of organisations that are big companies deciding how much effort they should put into security. And it's almost like there's a scale. And it's like, well, we could spend more money on security. All right? Now, and again, this is all sort of relative. We could spend more money on security, devices, software, training, whatever else it may be. And that is immediate term money that would come out of our pocket, out of our budget, out of potentially out of some of the incentives that a manager has and the objectives that a manager has in terms of keeping the cost down for a project. That would hit us immediately. So this is sort of this one side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, if we spend more, maybe we won't have a breach. Maybe it won't be as bad. Maybe we'd get some benefit out of it 3 years from now when we don't have the breach then. And it's just, you're trading off something that is an immediate term hit to the bottom line versus a potential saving later on. And the sort of difficult bit is that if we spend the right money on the right things, then nothing happens. It's not like all the other things they spend money on, where it's like, if we spend money on these features, then our revenue goes up, or our retention of customers goes up, or something else that is measurable and positive, as opposed to the security thing, which is there will be nothing to measure. The measure will be just like more days since last breach sort of thing. So that is a difficult thing, and we have to change that balance. And the way to change it is that penalties are going to change the equation of what happens if something goes wrong. So I give a good example in here. So TalkTalk in the UK, great big telco. So think if you're in Australia, it's like Telstra. If you're in the UK, it's US, it'll be AT&T or something like that. And they got owned in 2015 by a child. I think he was 16 at the time, 17 once he was charged, by a child using SQL Map, exploiting SQL injection. Now, the kid could probably barely even spell SQL. He certainly have no idea how SQL injection actually works, but he could download a free tool. He could point it against a great big organization and do them a huge amount of damage. How they let that get through is just unfathomable. Clearly, there was a lot of stuff missing. The education piece was missing. If they had had the bounty or the disclosure policy, maybe the kid would have reported it and cashed in. Like just a raft of other things, probably lacking all sorts of other defenses that should have been there. This is actually a case where something like web application firewalls make a lot of sense too. Like if you screw up underneath in that code, at least you've got another layer. That's a whole other story. We should talk about that another time. So they've screwed up seriously. Now they're a £1.8 billion revenue company. So they're big, massive. And as a result of this breach, which did impact a lot of customers, they got a fine from the Information Commissioner's Office, a record fine of £400,000. Now, to put that in context, I gave the example, I said, look, if you earn $100,000, nice six-figure income, you're doing well, that's like getting a $20 fine. Now, if you do earn $100,000, think about how much $20 means to you. You don't want to hand it out willy-nilly, but you might go and spend that on a nice lunch out. So it's just like an inconsequential amount of money. And when you look at other organisations that see that and they say, well, gee, TalkTalk got hacked. I only cost them $20. You know, how is that disincentive for another organisation not to have the same problem? How is that going to drive them to spend more on their security spend? Spend more on their security spend? I'm out of coffee. Anyway, you get the point. Now, if that was different, and I use GDPR again as an example here, because GDPR, one of the headline things about GDPR is fines that can potentially go up to 4% of granule, coffee again. Let's try that again. GDPR has fines that could go up to 4% of gross annual worldwide turnover. Now, 4% of £1.8 billion is something more like £72 million. And it's not to say that TalkTalk under GDPR would have got fined £72 million. But now we've got a ceiling which is significantly different. And the reality of it is we're going to see a whole range of different things in terms of penalties under GDPR. Now, I don't want to focus too much on GDPR because that's not the intention. The intention is to say that we need constructs where organisations are now conscious that they're going to get seriously stung if they screw up bad enough. I would argue that TalkTalk screwed up bad enough insofar as it was such a low-hanging vulnerability and it was so easily exploitable, it should not have been something that was there. Equifax screwed up badly enough. Not just because they didn't patch struts, but then in the way they handled it and the length of time they took to disclose it. Uber screwed up badly enough because they covered up extortion. So these are examples of where there needs to be some real financial lever such that they invest more in the first place. Now, I saw another comment come through very quickly this morning before I jumped on to do this, which was something along the lines of, there are cases where a data breach shouldn't have a penalty because the organisation's done many good things. And I agree with this, actually. I think that there are cases where an organisation can do everything within reason right, and I know that that then becomes a very legal term, reason. They can do everything within reason right, and they still get owned. And this, I guess, goes back to the recognition that security is never an absolute state. It's never like, yep, great, we're now 100% secure, all good. That's not how it works. So I want to recognise that because that is important. Where I think we need to end up, and maybe GDPR will be the precedent that starts taking us in that direction, is that we need to incentivise organisations to do everything right, such that if someone was to step back now and say, look, let's look at our landscape. If we were to get pinged today, would we be able to stand up and go, we gave this a red hot go to get it all right? We had people trained, we had security devices, we had easy disclosure policies, we even ran a bug bounty, and we still got stung. I would look at that, and then actually, let's add to that. After we got stung, we disclosed early, we were transparent, we had our customers' best interest in mind. I would say that a case like that doesn't deserve a financial penalty. But I want to see organisations incentivised to do all that stuff because that's going to dramatically reduce the chance of them having a serious incident in the first place. And I sort of round out this blog post by saying, in fact the whole series, by saying, what we're trying to do is incentivise people to do all the things that I've spoken about earlier. We're trying to change the financial equation such that they do invest in that and they do take it seriously. Because at the moment it's just not happening. In fact, the way I open that blog post, certainly not happening enough, is I say, look, what started to really stun me about 2 years ago now is that we would see an incident happen and it would be all over the press. And I give the example of Ashley Madison. Nobody could have missed the news about Ashley Madison. All over the press. And then several months later, someone else gets owned by some ridiculous low-hanging vulnerability. A company like VTech. They had like stupid things like direct object reference risks on APIs behind their mobile app that took me 5 minutes to find. That is just crazy. And what's happening here is that the people in those organizations like VTech are either just not watching the news, but how can you miss it? You know, like you couldn't miss Ashley Madison. They're not going back to their organizations and saying, hey guys, how are we? You know, I've heard that there's this data breach thing that happens a lot and it does a lot of damage to people. People killed themselves over Ashley Madison. how are we? Have we done our due diligence on this? So that's what we need penalties for, to force organisations to have that discussion, to look at what they do. And in the best case scenario, the penalties will never be levied. But the fear of them causes organisations to do the right thing. And that's it. That's the 5-part Fixing Data Breaches series. And look, like I said, that's going to be something that will be there for a long time, that I reference many, many, many times over. So look, I hope you found that really useful, and I hope that people share that, and I hope it actually makes a little bit of a difference, and that organisations take on board some of these things, because some of them, like the training, like the vulnerability reporting policies, like security.txt, they're dead simple to do. They're easy things. All right, let's start wrapping this up. Sponsor this week is Security Newsletter. So I was actually looking at this the other day, securitynewsletter.co. This is a really different type of sponsor to have on board. And look, it's a small operation that does security newsletters. And I was really glad to have something quite different on board. So I've had some great sponsors this year, some of them very large companies as well. But I'd really like you guys to go and check out Security Newsletter because it is actually good information. I'm looking at the last one here. And it's all the sorts of stuff that I regularly talk about. And also gives support to a small organisation trying to do cool things. And I appreciate them being my second last sponsor for the year. Got one more to go. So speaking of sponsorship, all of next year, all of 2018, except for 1 week in December, is now booked, which is awesome. Maybe that means I'm not pricing it right. I don't know. But it's very nice to have all of that booked out for a very long time. So you're going to see a bunch of organisations that you've seen before there next year, and a few that you haven't seen before as well. Some pretty cool ones actually are in there. So that'll all be coming out next year. I'll have one more weekly update to do in this year, which I'll probably get out on time because I won't have other work to do, which will be really nice. And look, I know this has been a super long one. I hope it's been useful because this, to me, how we fix data breaches is something very close to my heart. And I hope everyone goes and has an epic Christmas, and whether you're out in the sun or you're out snowboarding or doing something else awesome, please enjoy it, and thank you very much for watching. See you guys.